All right, how is everyone doing today? Welcome to my channel. This channel is for educational purposes. We try to check out theories, concepts, and discoveries that are very important, but that you probably never heard of because they've been suppressed or otherwise obscure, sometimes difficult readings, things that you might be intimidated of to kind of dig into. And I try to, hold your hand a little bit so that you can penetrate some of this stuff. Obviously you've got to do a lot of the work yourself. I'm just, trying to kind of be a little bit of a buffer and just help you overcome your intimidation, and so that you can go and do some further research. If you're looking for something handed to you on a silver platter, you probably should look elsewhere. But that will be coming eventually. But that's a ways off. Before you put something on a silver platter, you've got to be able to just figure out what it is first, and you have to break the path, so to speak. And today is another Bible Decode, number 275, and we've been looking into the New Testament and into the suppressed and relatively obscure idea of the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. That is, that the New Testament was actually written by the Roman Caesars of the Flavian dynasty between 69 and 96 AD, and in subsequent years also by the same people and their descendants, going all the way up to maybe 135 AD with the book of Hebrews, at least according to Abelard Reuchlin, one of the early scholars on this matter, with his true authorship of the New Testament, along with Roman Piso. Joseph Atwill kind of brought this into the 21st century with Caesar's Messiah and Shakespeare's Secret Messiah. Henry Davis, James Valiant, C.W. Fahey, Cliff Carrington, and the new book from Michael Menescot's that just came out last year called Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. And also shout out to Bruno Bauer in the late 19th century, and James Valentine Hannay, and some of the other folks at Oxford in the early 20th century had kind of figured this out. Many authors, famous authors, throughout the years have figured this out also, including William Shakespeare, who was actually a Jewish woman who every last one of her 39 plays, or how many ever he has, all of them are about the Romans and the Jews, and that the Romans created the New Testament as a psychological operation against the Jews. The Shakespearean corpus is nothing but a retaliation for that psychological operation enacted 15 plus centuries later. Now, the evidence for this is relatively overwhelming, and it's been covered in my previous 200 videos or so. I just say that the Romans had a motive to mellow out or tame or domesticate the Jews, because the Jews were a big pain in the side of the Romans for over 100 years of colonization or control, and especially the Flavians, because they were also concerned about shoring up their position as kind of a new dynasty, especially after the year of the 4 emperors, where the previous 4 emperors had all been assassinated within the last 12 months. And what they did is they wrote the Gospels, and then they backdated the story by 40 plus years. And then they also wrote a book called War of the Jews, which is a history of the war between the Jews and the Romans between 66 and 73 AD. That was really the culmination of all of the militant, aggressive behavior of the Jews, according to, the Romans. And that book came out under the name of Josephus, Flavius Josephus. And it's pretty much undisputable that that particular book, in 7 volumes, was a production of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars. But if you read War of the Jews alongside the Gospels, you will recognize, with your eyes open, you will recognize that those 2 books were written by the same entities, Josephus, or whether it was a team of people or a family of people. The 2 books parallel each other, parody each other, and parable each other back and forth, such that there is an inescapable conclusion that they were written by the same people at the same time for the same reason. And this was really covered not only by Joseph Atwill, but also in depth by Michael Menescatz, where he dug into the book of Luke and found over 250 parallels just in the book of Luke. It's over 10 per chapter. That means that they're completely saturating the book of Luke, parallels and parables. And some of them are incredibly devious and well hidden, well thought out, almost artistic or even artistic in their construction. The intention of the Romans is mean-spirited and brutal humor, mocking, ridiculing. It's unmistakable that it is intentional. There is not any coincidence involved. Of the 250 parallels, maybe 25 of them are coincidental. But the other 225 are intentional. And Menescatz not only does that, but then he graphs the parallels on a chart, putting the book of Luke on the vertical axis and War of the Jews on the horizontal axis, to find that he's constructed 5 near-perfect letters in Latin, the language, or at least one of the 2 languages of the Roman Caesars. APTVS, and I think that stands for Titus Vespasian, T and the V. Those are, Vespasian and Titus are the 2 first Flavian emperors. And Titus's younger brother Domitian rounds out the triumvirate there. Joseph Atwill also noticed that Jesus's ministry in Judea, as described in the book of Luke, Jesus's ministry in Judea is nothing but a copy of Titus's military campaign in Judea, as it recounted by War of the Jews. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes, in the same order, and they encounter parallel events at each location that are spaced out by 40 years in time. And we're talking about over 40 separate events that all fit in the same, they're all synchronized. We also have parallels between the life of Josephus, as explained in War of the Jews, and the life of Jesus. this is where the parables or the parallels go the other way, where Josephus is a copy of Jesus' life. Or Joseph Atwell uses the term typology, which you can also see in the life of Jesus in the book of Matthew. At the very beginning of the book of Matthew, Jesus's life is nothing but a parallel of the life of Moses, as recounted in Genesis and Exodus. So there are so many parallels that it's kind of even ridiculous. You can't talk about it in just one video. You can't even talk about it in 100 videos, that there are so many of them. But they just haven't seen the light of day, and most Christians, including the truthers out there, the ones that are follow the 17th letter and that are instrumental in hopefully some type of awakening that is occurring here. Even those truthers can't handle this truth, and they refuse to dig into it. Even though they know exactly what a psyop is, they figured out that the Kennedy assassination is a psyop, and that the number that you use to call emergency is a psyop, and everything in between was a psyop. But they can't roll the clock back 1950 years to recognize that their savior is also a psyop, and maybe was based on factual occurrences, and that's where the Dead Sea Scrolls may come in. The Dead Sea Scrolls were not discovered until the 1940s and 50s, but they were written at the latest, the 1st century AD, maybe even earlier, and they describe a way of life and a narrative that is somewhat similar to what happened in the New Testament. And so we are looking right now at a book from Robert Eisenman that's called Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians, and Qumran, which is about the now Qumran is the location where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, about 20 miles from Jerusalem, and this is where these dwellers, these monks, basically had their fortress or their monastery, and they were very ascetic and strict, and they didn't believe in, they were celibate, and they wrote a lot of material. Not only did they have copies of all of the Old Testament books, the oldest copies that have ever been discovered by hundreds of years, but they also wrote a lot of sectarian material, which is strictly for their sect, describing their lives, what they thought, how they conceived of God, and how they conceived of the world and their place in it. And so Eisenman was instrumental in unlocking the Dead Sea Scrolls, because they originally had been given custody to these Dominican priests who basically hoarded them and didn't release them to the public because they had embarrassing information to the Catholic Church, presumably. And so for really over 40 years, these documents were not shared with the general public. Eisenman forced this to happen in the late 80s, early 90s, and so he has a bird's eye glimpse of what these documents are all about, and he goes over that, also covers the Maccabees and the Zadokites, and those are Jewish, Maccabees were a dynasty of Jewish kings from the 2nd to 1st century AD, when the Jews enjoyed a level of sovereignty that was brought on by the Maccabees. The Zadokites are the priestly class, all going all the way back to Solomon and David, and you know what Christians are. So let's start reading Eisenman and see how far we can get here. Now, Eisenman, he does a lot of detective work, piecing together one document here, one snippet over here, he's difficult to read. This is a surface reading of this. I'm not even reading any of the footnotes. The footnotes make up probably 2/3 of the text. So this is just giving you the surface of Eisenman. Now, if you really want to learn this, maybe we'll go over it again in the advanced class. But right now, we're just doing kind of his musings on this subject. He has parentheticals everywhere, asides everywhere. We're going to probably skip over most of that stuff and all of the footnotes. So, this is not the be-all, end-all of Robert Eisenman, but this is just, kind of getting his point of view, because he's not been exposed to this Roman origins hypothesis, but he's scratching at the door of it. He wasn't aware of it at the time of this writing, but he senses it, because you can sense it, because what the hell is Jesus doing, being totally deferential to the Romans and being completely castigating of the Jews? And what the hell is Paul doing, being even more deferential to the Romans and castigating of the Jews? That is enough to raise a bunch of red flags. And so that's kind of what Eisenman is doing here, but he doesn't have the full structure of, being able to kind of read Josephus in the same light that, say, Joseph Atwill did. Okay, we are now in a position to reconstruct some of the history of the so-called Sadducean or Zadokite movement. This Sadducean, as in the Sadducees. I propose this to stand as an alternative to some of the history of the Essenes, quote, history of the Essenes, we see so often in Qumran research, and which have stood so unchallenged for the last 20 years. Perhaps the first truly Zadokite priest, leaving aside the originator of the terminology, Ezekiel himself, was Ezra. Here, too, we leave aside possible plays on the name of the last high priest before the captivity, Jehozadak, and the possibility that the author of the Zadokite statement was preparing the way for the return of Jehozadak's family in the person of his son Jesus. Now, I'm not really getting that fully. My Old Testament understanding is not up to par to get that. A century later, Ezra, with the same genealogy as Jesus, is superficially at least more substantial, though much overlapping exists between his actions and those of Nehemiah's. For this reason, the possibility that the character of Ezra himself might simply be a priestly fiction superimposed on more secular material should not be ruled out. But this does not affect the zealot/Zadokite character of the presentation. Zadokite basically means righteousness, and the righteousness goes right to the Dead Sea Scrolls, where the three main characters of the narrative are the teacher of righteousness, the wicked priest, and the liar. So, given the portrait we have, however, Ezra certainly can lay claim to the priestly zeal of the covenant of Phinehas. For no more zealous priest is on record unless it be the lawgiver himself. Whether he actually did service at the altar is impossible to determine since our sources are so imperfect. He presides over festivities in the temple like some powerful vicegerent. I think maybe he means vice-regent. I'm not familiar with the word gerent, but it's just switching the G and the E around, or the R and the G around. So I am familiar with the term vice-regent. So anyway, the rededication of the temple implicit in his reading of the law is echoed in Judas Maccabees presiding over a similar rededication 250 years later, accompanied by the institution of a similar festival. Whether Ezra's piety and zeal are sufficient to entitle him to the sobriquet, the Zadok, as the Quran would imply, is open to question. If the Zadokite priesthood does not go back to pre-exilic times, then our renascent Zadokite or righteous priesthood must date from this period. Well, I guess I'm under the impression that Zadok was one of the priests of David, but apparently that he's dropping that theme and he's moving forward into Ezra's time, which was, I think, like 4th and 5th century BC, and he's kind of using the theme, but not in particular the person or even his family, Zadok. From Ezra's time to the time of Simeon the Just, in the 3rd to 2nd centuries BC, we go into something of a tunnel, and very little is clear until we emerge with what appears to be a Zadokite priesthood in the person of Simeon the Zadok himself. Whatever else this priesthood adhering to Simeon's family might have been, it was obviously considered a righteous one, with the title of the Zadok prominent among its accoutrements. The confusion of dates for this first definitive Zadok may simply be the confusion of two Simeon the Zadoks, since the family names seem to alternate back and forth between use of the names Onias and Simeon. Onias III, possibly also surnamed the Just, martyred at the time of the Maccabean uprising, which I believe was like 170 BC or thereabouts. At the time of the Maccabean uprising, and probably the son of Simeon in Ecclesiasticus. And Ecclesiasticus is an apocryphal book, is very definitely presented as a Zadok and probably a suffering servant as well, in quotes. So that's meaning more or less that's terminology used in the Dead Sea Scrolls documents. In an extremely important section of 2nd Maccabees, the book which presents Judas's claims to be a Zadok and as messianic battle priest, the leader of the Hasidian movement, Onias, is not only called a Hasid, or pious one, and this zealot for the laws, but also, quote, protector or shield of his fellow countrymen. Despite its equal importance to the notice about Judas and his 9 Zadokim, this passage has also been totally ignored by modern scholarship, though it is quite possibly the basis for similar statements about the person of James the Just, the brother of Jesus, another Zadok and putative priestly heir, according to early church testimony. It is perhaps because of this extremely pious presentation of Onias, who cures and resurrects an enemy of God through his righteous sacrifice and is resurrected himself alongside with the prophet Jeremiah as a kind of ancient of days to offer Judas the messianic battle sword in the concluding episode, and the miraculous appearances of heavenly horsemen that 2nd Maccabees is held in such low esteem. Yet aside from these shortcomings attributable to lapses of pious enthusiasm, it describes itself as being based on an earlier and much longer work by Jason of Cyrene. It contains much that is authentic, including official correspondence, a portrait of Onias patently more reliable than the confusion of 1st Maccabees, and first-rate material on Judas's relation to the Hasidians. As should be obvious by now, if I didn't mention it, 1st and 2nd Maccabees are also apocryphal works. I even heard that there is a 3rd and 4th Maccabees, which I'm not familiar with. I haven't read any of them, for disclosure. As should be obvious by now to the reader, unlike majority scholarly opinion, I consider it more reliable on the whole than 1st Maccabees. The latter suffers from certain apologetic aims regarding the whole of the Maccabean family, in particular the progeny of Simon through John Hyrcanus, the real hero of its narrative. Pro-Hasidian in a manner that 1st Maccabees is not. 2nd Maccabees exhibits many of the characteristics of what must be called a Hasidian type literature, to cite two thoroughgoing apocalyptic and a stress on resurrection of the dead. Besides having something of the appearance of a Hanukkah Haggadah, it seems to have been written to correct the inaccurate portrayal of Judas Maccabee and the slanderous presentation of the Hasidian movement he headed in 1st Maccabees. That Judas and Onias are found so closely linked in its account argues very forcibly that its authors felt no break from the Zadokite priesthood of the one to the Zadokite priesthood of the other. That both were also zealots needs no further elucidation. The testimony of books like Daniel, Enoch, the Testament of Levi, etc., can be employed at this point to clinch the case for the similarity in aims between Maccabees, the previous priesthood of Simeon and Onias, and the Hasidians. One must, to be sure, concede the point that the saintly Kedoshim of Daniel are equivalent to what is called Hasidian in the Maccabee books and Josephus, a correspondence not difficult to acknowledge. And this is kind of a theme that Eisenman has throughout so far, is just that a lot of these different terms are really referring to the same thing. He also brings in Josephus here, who he's not aware is writing fiction and propaganda and psychological operations and not history. That just has to be noted. I take Daniel in any event, if not Enoch as well, to be products of this Hasidian type literature. Here, among other things, it will be objected that 1st Maccabees portrays the Hasidians as having deserted Judas Maccabee for a quisling high priest loyal to the Seleucids. Those were the Greek Syrians that basically controlled Judea before the Maccabees overthrew them. For 2nd Maccabees, Judas is the leader par excellence of those Jews called Hasidians, who are warmongers and revolutionaries. As at Qumran and in Ecclesiasticus, no distinction is made between Zadok and Hasid, and Judas's Zadokim double as Hasidians. In one account, the Hasidians are the loyalist partisans of Judas Maccabee, In the other, they are treacherous backsliders who go over to his Seleucid-backed opponents. Okay, let's try to do one more paragraph here. How can the two be reconciled? Actually, it is not so difficult if one remarks that the behavior of the so-called Hasidians in 1st Maccabees resembles very much the behavior of the Pharisees during the reign of Alexander Jannaeus at the time of the incursion by Demetrius. These are really all part of the Maccabean dynasty. The way out of the impasse is to assume both accounts are true and that there are two groups of Hasidians, one loyalist or purist, which must be identical with those whom we have been calling the Zadokites. The other, a breakaway, which has been rightly termed Pharisees. It even might be assumed that both saw themselves as authentic Hasidians until gradually the new terminology supplanted the old. Okay, so next time we'll be getting into more about the split here between the so-called Pharisees and the Zadokites that occurred in this, late first, early second, early second, late first century BC split among the Maccabees. And, he's just trying to get the terminology straight so that we can kind of understand how it fits in with the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so we will embark on that tomorrow. And meanwhile, like, share, subscribe, and come back tomorrow and have a great